Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session. It's indeed a great pleasure to chair this keynote lecture on the politics of European disintegration and to have with us Stefanie Walter. Stefanie is a professor of international relations and political economy at the Department of Political Science at the University of Zurich. She holds a PhD in political science at ETH, Zurich, and her research focuses on the field of international and comparative political economy, in particular on distributional conflicts and political preferences and economic policy outcome related to globalization, financial crisis, and European integration. Most recent work examined the backlash against globalization and the politics of international non-cooperation. Among others, she has published in the top journal of political science, such as the American Journal of Political Science, the Annals Review of Political Science, international organizations. She's also the author of 2 books, one on financial crisis and the politics of macroeconomic adjustment, published for Cambridge University Press about 10 years ago, and she's co-author of a second one on the politics of bad options, published in 2020 by Oxford University Press. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Stefanie. You have up to 35 minutes, and my suggestion is that you take questions at the end, unless there are some urgent clarification questions on your side. Okay, so please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Silvia, for having me, and Claudia for inviting me both. It's a real pleasure to be here and to talk to you about the mass politics of disintegration. And I think this talk links up nicely with the session that we just have with Timo and Jonathan on Brexit, because you will see that Brexit also plays a role in my paper here. Oh, why does it not work? Oh, there we go. So what I'm going to talk about is international cooperation, especially in the form of international institutions, and what it means when they come under pressure by voters, right? And we've sort of heard voters here and there, all morning long. There's good solutions. Many, Lauro talked about how there's so many aggregate gains to be won. Why is it so hard to do it? And voters, of course, have a role to play in that. I'm going to focus on so-called voter-endorsed challenges to existing international institutions. So those are processes in which one member state of an international institution attempts to unilaterally either not comply with or change the terms of or withdraw from an existing international agreement, be that an international treaty or an international organization, right? And that happens on the basis of a strong popular mandate. So say a referendum vote or a key campaign promise. That's the type of cases I'm looking here. And you can see here some examples. So of course, the Greek referendum in 2015, for example, obviously, Donald Trump's campaign promise to end the Iran deal, to renegotiate NAFTA, and these kind of things. Then, of course, Brexit, or also if we think about non-compliance, the rule of law crisis, which also has a strong populist voter-based component because people vote for, governments like the Orban government. So these challenges have grown in recent years. What you can see here is all foreign policy referendums that were done worldwide between 1970 and 2019. And you see that for a long time, these referendums were on establishing or deepening international cooperation, either in forms of accession or in getting more cooperation done. Think of the referendums on the Lisbon Treaty, for example. But in recent years, we've seen a growth of referendums that really are that propose to not cooperate or not comply with or withdraw from existing treaties. So, of course, the Brexit referendum is here. You can see that here. But also Switzerland, where I'm based, has had its share of such non-cooperative referendums, right? And what you can see also on the right-hand side is that the outcomes of referendums overall have become more fraught, and that the incidence of rejection, where voters have been voted not in favor of cooperation, but in favor of non-cooperation, has also markedly increased. So in the last decade, it was about 50-50 whether a referendum would go through in favor of cooperation or non-cooperation. So that raises the question for the other member states and for the international institution, how to respond, right? How to deal with these kind of things. And you can already see how Brexit comes into that, because of course the EU had to decide also on how to deal with Brexit. But of course also Canada and Mexico had to decide on how to deal with Trump's I will renegotiate NAFTA promise, or Greece had to decide on whether to get out of the euro, or the other member states better had to decide on how to react to Greece's referendum to not support the austerity measures, right? So what I would argue is, or what I argue in this bigger project that I have here, this is based on my ERC project, is that there's sort of two broad categories, and then of course lots of gray in the middle that countries can choose. One is accommodation and one is non-accommodation. If you cannot hear me anymore and you would like to close the windows, that's fine, but I think the heat noise trade-off is maybe slightly in favor of heat, like of keeping the noise. And anyway, so accommodation means that you modify international, no, let's keep it open, no? I mean, I think, yeah. Unless you, like, if it's too loud for you, close it. But if it's not, I think we can, for me, it's fine. So accommodation means modifying international agreements along the lines demanded, granting exceptions, negotiating new agreements in line with the withdrawing country's demands. So the good example here is the NAFTA renegotiation. Essentially, what Canada, Mexico, and the US did was renegotiate a new deal that is very much like NAFTA, but slightly better terms, has slightly better terms for the US, and is now called USMCA, right? But essentially what the other two countries did, they just accommodated Trump, because otherwise NAFTA would have just failed, right? Greece faced a different situation. There, they basically, the other member states of the Eurozone said, well, either you accept austerity or you can leave the Euro. So that was a strategy that I would characterize as non-accommodation. You make no concessions, no exceptions, and you attempt to make withdrawal costly for the challenging state, right? And again, you can think of it as a continuum, right? Those are the two extreme ideal types. So the problem with this is that both of these strategies are costly, right? The main risk associated with accommodation is that there's a risk of political contagion effects. Because the more beneficial the outcome of a challenge is for the challenging state, the higher is the likelihood that voters in other countries, or also governments in other countries, will push for similar challenges, right? I call this the encouragement effect. So that can create significant risk for the long-term stability of the international institution and for international cooperation more generally, right? Because basically you reward non-cooperative behavior, if you think of it in a game theoretic setting. But non-accommodation is also costly, right? Because you risk to lose a lot of cooperation gains. We know that reintroducing barriers to cooperation is costly. That's why they were removed in the first place. So if you get rid of that, you introduce trade barriers, you create transaction costs, you lose shared information, all these kind of things, right? That exposure may vary across member states of an institution. It may also vary across issues, right? But nonetheless, it can be quite costly, and there can be quite a lot of cooperation gains at risk. But that creates a dilemma, right? Because none of these are really, there's no clear sort of top option usually. Both of them have pros and cons. Accommodation maintains cooperative relations, that's the benefit, but it changes the distribution of cooperation gains in favor of the challenging state, and it carries long-term contagion and reputational risks because it might encourage other countries to pursue similar strategies in the future. On the other hand, non-accommodation has also advantages. It deters similar challenges by others because it's really not very attractive if you're not accommodated. It also creates the possibility that the challenging state reverts to cooperative behavior. Switzerland did that, for example, after the 2014 mass immigration vote, or Greece basically did that too. But of course, if that does not happen, this can be very costly materially because it really does put a lot of cooperation gains at risk. And these costs can also materialize quickly and broadly if the challenging state does not back down, right? So taken together, that creates a dilemma where non-accommodation is costly, but accommodation may encourage further challenges, right? So, and then international institutions and member states, the other member states need to balance this, right? And what this, you can sort of think of it in a very stylized manner in a 2x2, where you have lower high cooperation gains at risks and lower high contagion risks. And things are fairly easy when you have a lot of cooperation gains at risk, but the contagion risks are fairly low. Then you just accommodate, right? Think of the NAFTA renegotiations. Also quite clear when you have a lot of contagion risk, but not a lot of cooperation gains at risk, then you don't cooperate, then you don't accommodate, right? And things, of course, as always difficult when the two sides balance themselves out. Not so bad when cooperation gains and contagion risks are both low, because then it's at least the costs are not so high. But of course, when the costs are high, then you really have a very pronounced accommodation dilemma, and then the politics become very messy and difficult. Okay, so that's sort of the theoretical framework. And what I wanted to present to you is some of the empirical evidence that we've been collecting on these issues in the past couple of years. And I want to sort of show you evidence on two sets of questions. The first one is, do voter-endorsed challenges really have contagion effects, right? I'll show you evidence in the context of Brexit, because now we often hear that all this worry about contagion, it didn't happen. The EU shouldn't have worried so much about that. And I will show you that that's perhaps a bit of a simplistic take, because the risk for contagion was actually real. And then I'll show you some evidence on how member states respond to voter-endorsed challenges to international institutions. I have a comparative case study of 7 referendum-endorsed challenges and then responses to that, and some survey evidence also on individual negotiation preferences. All right, so we'll start with the first question on whether voter-endorsed challenges actually have contagion effects. And I have, maybe now should we wanna, sorry. We tried. Oh, that's okay. I'm fine up here. Yeah. So this gave you at least a chance to look at these beautiful pictures a bit longer. One stands for the contagion effect. It's from Front National. They put that out right after the Brexit referendum, and it says Brexit et maintenant la France. Right. So it shows really this spread. The other one is from the Carnival in Cologne, which shows you more of a deterrence effect, right? That maybe Brexit is not sort of seen so positively in other countries. All right, so did Brexit reverberate abroad and how, right? So as I just said, one important concern after the Brexit referendum in 2016 was indeed that other countries would follow on a similar path, right? That you would suddenly have all kinds of member states asking for exit or for renegotiation and opt-outs and so on. So the question really is, how warranted were these concerns? Were they real, right? Did such contagion dynamics actually occur? And I've done a lot of research on that alone and with several of the postdocs in my team. And what we find is that there's actually considerable evidence for Brexit-related contagion effects, both in the encouragement and in the deterrence direction, and also both among individual voters and among political elites. I'll walk you through some of the results. So the first thing to know is that the European public was really interested in Brexit. And it really follows a pattern that, that wasn't just a general interest, but it really peaks at key moments of the Brexit negotiations. So here we have the weekly internet searches on Google on Brexit. And you can see that it peaks here during the first times, that's when the withdrawal agreement starts to hit difficulties in the UK Parliament. Then this big chunk here is then when the UK almost crashed out of the EU for the first time. Then again in November, here Boris Johnson gets elected, and this is the actual. Hello. All right, so there was a lot of interest, right? And the interesting thing is that you can really see how the European public opinion varies over time with Brexit. What I did was I ran a series of every 6 months during the Brexit negotiations, or the withdrawal negotiations, I ran a survey among about 10,000 Europeans. It was a sample of all the EU 27 countries. And one of the questions I asked was, how do you think, what will, in 5 years, will Brexit make the UK better off, much better off, worse off, and so on, right? And the other one was to ask if in your own country there were a referendum on the EU, how would you vote? Yes or no? Right? And what you can see here is that there's quite some change over time. Overall, from the start, quite a lot of people. For some reason there's a 4 missing here, but slightly less than half people thought that Brexit was overall going to be better for the UK in the long run, and that dropped significantly over time. And support for exit was also quite high at the beginning of the negotiations and then dropped. And it has this outlier here in June 2019. And that corresponds very nicely with this here. What I have here is the British euro exchange rate as a proxy for how markets viewed how Brexit was going, right? And what you can see that in the beginning was things were still going well, but then Brexit, the negotiations start hitting difficulties. And this is really then when Brexit becomes really difficult and the UK almost crashes out, it really goes down. And you can see it here also how these things go down. Now, this is, of course, just descriptive, right? But we've looked at this also in a much more causally identified manner, both around time. And then here we have a few things. This is with my postdoc, Giorgio Male, where we use, unexpected event during survey designs to really get more at the causal effects of these things. And what you can see here is, for example, that people who were surveyed just after Theresa May was challenged over the Brexit deal, and also just like when we compare them to who were surveyed before, people were surveyed over, of course, say 4 weeks, and then some before, then, the UK Parliament rejects the first withdrawal agreement, and some were after. And what you can see is that there's a significant increase in support for European integration among voters in the other member states. So this is the EU 27. I'm always looking at the EU perspective, right? So this is really a clear deterrence effect, that the mess of Brexit made people in the EU appreciate the EU more, right? And we see the opposite also, for example, for the Boris Johnson victory, that Boris Johnson election victory made people less convinced that the EU was going in a good direction. Right? We know that overall deterrence ultimately dominated. So support for exit in the EU has gone down significantly since the Brexit referendum, but encouragement effects were really a possibility, especially among certain voters. What you can see here is from a survey where I asked people, here's 6 possible goals for the Brexit negotiations. Which one would you support? Among all voters, it's maintaining my country's trade relations with the UK. Among Europhiles, those who think that the EU is good, the main goal is to avoid that other countries leave the EU in the future. So they were concerned about the contagion effect. But then a small majority of the Eurosceptics says the key goal should be to establish a standard procedure that makes it easier for countries to leave the EU in the future. Right? So again, you see that that risk of contagion was actually there and real. Right? What I've shown you so far is on voters. We can also see this when we look at political elites, in particular populist right parties. Here we've looked at several nationalist parties and looked at sort of their press statements that they've made. And what you can see is here a measure of how aggressive they are. So here they sort of support the status quo of the EU. Here they say the EU needs to reform. Here they say the EU needs to reform, or otherwise our country should leave. And here they say we should just leave, right? And what you can see overall is that over time, things changed a bit. The uptick here is a bit, I think the problem is that we ended it right at the end of the transition period. It would have been interesting to see afterwards, I think. And this was also, I think, when the vaccine things were just heating up. So I think it's a bit of I think if we prolonged the time frame, would probably go down again. But the interesting thing is what you can really see here is that the peak is around the referendum. There's a lot of support for leave here. And then it goes down significantly. And then during the first Brexit mess, it's when really also the rhetoric really becomes much less aggressive. And you can see this here nicely. This is really demands for leave. You can really see how, just right after the almost crash out, the demand for leave really goes down. Right? And then finally, we see contagion effects not just in the EU, we also see it in countries closely associated with the EU, most notably Switzerland. Switzerland is an interesting case because it also has a difficult relationship with the EU. And right at the time when the Brexit, the 2019 chaos happened, there were a couple of referendums on EU-Swiss relations in the making. And I ran a survey before the exit date, and then 2 weeks, we didn't really know what was going to happen. And then after 2 weeks, when it was clear that the EU was going to sort of extend the period, then I ran another survey. And here is the comparison between vote intentions in favor of closer cooperation with the EU in several upcoming referendums. One is the weapons reform, which essentially put the Schengen membership of Switzerland that implied if Switzerland had rejected that, we would have been ejected out of Schengen. Then the limitation initiative, which was on immigration. Then the framework agreement, which is perhaps one of the closest things, because it really is about the overall relations between Switzerland and EU. The Swiss have actually never voted on this because the government aborted the negotiations in 21. But at that time, when we fielded the survey, everybody thought we were about to vote on it. And this was sort of a more hypothetical one on terminating the bilateral treaties. And what you can see in all of these referendums is that after the Brexit mess, people became much less inclined to vote non-cooperatively, right? And were much more willing to support cooperation. So again, we really see these deterrence effects in this case of the very tough negotiation strategy. So the basically what this shows is that the what the EU did in the Brexit negotiations, I would argue, is more of a non-accommodative negotiation strategy, and they did achieve the goal of reducing the contagion risk and then creating more of a deterrence effect. Okay. But of course, that does raise that question, right? How do member states respond to voter-endorsed challenges to international institutions, given that we now know that contagion effects are actually real and that these things actually exist, right? So when are they accommodating and when do they not accommodate, right? So I've looked at, because I've been interested in sort of this voter-based challenges, I've looked at disintegration referendums. Those are referendums that are really aimed at getting out of existing international treaties or organizations, and really sort of being outright on non-compliance, right? Really having these voter-based challenges, right? There's only 7 that we've seen so far. It's not a lot, but you can look at them in detail. That's the plus, right? And as a political scientist, I'm allowed to do some qualitative work too, so that's kind of nice. So what we're looking here is referendums that look at renegotiation or withdrawal, right? And it's quite a diverse set of cases that cover quite a variety of different issues. 2 of them cover membership in the EC or in the EU. That's Greenland in '82, when Greenland left the European communities, and of course the Brexit referendum in 2016. And we have several referendums on debt repayment and austerity and living up to sort of international commitments in that sense. There was a more consultative referendum in Brazil in 2000. Then we have the 2 ICE-safe referendums in Iceland about honoring debt towards the UK and the Netherlands. And then, of course, the Greek bailout referendum. And then we have that's actually wrong, it should be 2014, the mass immigration initiative referendum in Switzerland in 2014, right? And just as a reminder, sort of this is sort of the very simple 2x2 framework, where we expect that really how member states respond is driven by how much cooperation gains at risk and how big the contagion risks are. And we expect accommodation here, non-accommodation here. And then here's the accommodation dilemma, and it's particularly difficult here. And I just realized that in the graph that I'm going to show you, it's going to be turned around. But I'll walk you through that. So first, if you want to do qualitative work, you also need to think about measurement. So here I classify the level of cooperation gains at risk and contagion risks. And the problem is that these are so different, right? So you need to have you need to somehow conceptualize this in a way that you can, even though the issues are so different, you can still somehow assess that. So the cooperation gains at risk essentially come in 3 dimensions: the size of potential losses, how big are they? The breadth of potential losses, is it just on one dimension, say, the debt or something, or is it on, economic and political relations more broadly? And then is it a one-off or a long-term or repeated loss? So does it happen once, or does it, accrue over and over again? And then the bigger, the broader, and the more long-term these losses are, the higher are the cooperation gains at risk. Right? And for contagion risks, I'm going to look at 2 dimensions: the attractiveness of an accommodative solution to others, because sometimes it's very specific to one specific state, and then the attractiveness is not so high. So that's uniqueness. The attractiveness is sort of, would others like to have a similar solution? Switzerland, for example, asked for opt-outs in the free movement of people, and you can think of other countries that might want to have the same thing. And the other one is the uniqueness of the case. How easy is it to transport that solution to someone else, right? So the more attractive and the less unique cases are, the higher are contagion risks, right? And if you want, I have some slides where I show you how exactly I do this and how I classify these different cases. Because we don't have that much time, I'll just show you the results. So this is what I meant. You have to flip it around. Here's corporation gains at risk. Here they're very low and very high. And here's contagion risk. They're low here and high here. So that means that here we expect the strong accommodation dilemma, right? Because it's really both costs are high. Then we have in this cell, corporation gains are not so high, but contagion risks are high. So you expect non-accommodation. And down here, corporation gains are high, but the contagion risk is not so high, right? And what you can see is that we have these referendums come up in really a lot of these cells. The ones that we've heard most about and that were most contentious are really up here in the accommodation dilemma one. It's Switzerland in 2014, which was not accommodated, Greece in 2015, which was also not accommodated, and in the UK in 2016, which was limited accommodation. There were some, some accommodation, but broadly. So this idea of we will remain basically, we'll go out of the EU, but keep all the benefits and drop the things that we don't like. That was sort of the promise of the Brexit referendum. That was certainly not accommodated. And then I'm just going to walk through this here. We can talk about this more, but I don't want to, take up too much of the time so we can have a discussion. Greenland, for example, is the case where there was quite a lot of, the corporation gains at risk are medium because really Greenland is not a major trading partner of the EU or of the EC at that time, but at the same time was very broad because it was contained about all the relations, right? But what made Greenland also like a case where the EU could accommodate was that the contagion risk was relatively low, because it was a very unique case. Greenland had become a member of the European communities because it was a Danish colony. There had been a Danish referendum on EC membership, and the Greenlanders had voted against it. But they still became part of it because they were a colony. Then they became they decolonized and became their own country, or that's kind of odd status. And then they said, look, we never wanted to be part of this in the first place. Can we now leave? But this is, in terms of contagion effect, very different. If you think about Scotland, for example, there the contagion risk would be much higher because then Spain immediately thinks of Catalonia, for example, right? But the Greenlandish case is different. And nonetheless, when you look at the sources, you do see that Italy, for example, had some reservations because they said they were unsure about Sardinia, that they might raise similar things. So it's interesting, right, that you see that the contagion risks were even there on the agenda, so that's why it's not at very low, but of course it was quite unique, and it was certainly much less of contagion risk than, say, for the UK or for the Swiss demands to, have some limitations on free movement of people. Okay, so that's, of course, some qualitative, more suggestive evidence. We also can see that voters actually understand the accommodation dilemma and respond to that. What we can see, and this is just one graph, I have a whole paper on this, that among EU27 respondents, a pro-EU attitude, and sort of I take that as a proxy that you are concerned about contagion because you care about the EU, that really decreases your willingness to accommodate the UK in the Brexit negotiations. And exposure to the loss of corporation gains increases your willingness to accommodate, measured either individually, that you say, what do you think will be the effect of Brexit on your own country, or measured by whether you live in a region that is expected to have a high fallout from a no-deal Brexit. So there are some estimates for different regions, and that varies dramatically, right? So, of course, Ireland is most affected, but then some country, some regions in Bulgaria are not really that affected. And what you can see is that really matters. So exposure to the loss of corporation gains makes people more willing to accommodate. And what you see here is essentially the accommodation dilemma and sort of the difficulty of deciding between the two when you are both concerned about contagion risk because you are an EU supporter. This is the marginal effect of being pro-EU. But also you worry about the fallout, right? That means that you think that Brexit will have a really bad effect on your own country, or you live in a region where the negative effect of Brexit is likely to be large, because then you're much more accommodated. So if you are an EU supporter, you're much more willing to accommodate if it doesn't have any costs. But when you are a EU supporter and you live in a region where you think that for your country this would be really costly, you're much more moderate. So voters also see these kind of things. All right. So the main findings of this part of my project is that both the potential loss of existing cooperation gains and contagion risk influence responses. Right? The politics of managing these disintegration bids is particularly difficult when both of these spillover effects, the contagion and reputational dynamics and the loss of cooperation gains, are large. That's when you really have a pronounced accommodation dilemma. And we see that this is something that not just governments understand when they negotiate, and of course representatives from international organizations, but also individuals have an intuitive understanding of this. So you see that individual negotiation preferences reflect the difficult trade-offs inherent in the accommodation dilemma. And before I end, I just want to sort of broaden this beyond sort of just like, disintegration and the EU, but really to think about what this means more generally for dealing with non-cooperation and non-cooperative relations in international relations, which is unfortunately a trend that we have been experiencing, right? It's becoming more and more difficult to cooperate. So I would argue that the accommodation dilemma is likely to characterize other situations also in which one country is behaving non-cooperatively. So of course, the immediate case is where you have non-cooperative renegotiation or withdrawal challenges by elites rather than by voters, right? But also getting reluctant countries to participate in international institutions. Think of the Swiss who don't want to really be more closely interacting with the EU, responding to non-compliance. Right? Think of the rule of law crisis, but really any non-compliance, but also economic sanctions, right? And sort of really sanctioning non-cooperative, like crass non-cooperative behavior, like war or, in the Iran case, the nuclear buildup and so on. And I would argue that the accommodation dilemma also helps us understand these negotiations and the trade-offs, especially, that we face when navigating these situations, right? And there's some evidence, again, in this case on the voter level, but I'm working on sort of more aggregate level stuff as well, where I've run a couple of surveys, and including survey experiments on different situations. One is responding to cherry-picking attempts and non-compliance. So, for example, the rule of law crisis, but also dealing with Switzerland, for example. Then responding to serious violations of international law, Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and also responding to coercive bargaining and international negotiations more broadly, right? So, how the Swedish and Finnish response to Turkey's veto of NATO membership. How do you respond? Because in the essence, you also need to think about, do you acquiesce or not, right? And what we find there is that, again, this is really survey data, but when we highlight the cost of accommodation, non-accommodation in experiments, that tends to move respondents' willingness to compromise. Dilemma situations are particularly difficult, right? And then what you can see here, this is just the descriptive part, but I thought easier. You can really see that people who care, say, about security proxy, but these are people who want to have more defense spending, they're much more willing to support more Russia sanctions, right? And then people who are dissatisfied with the economy and worry more, presumably, about the fallout from such sanctions, they're less likely, significantly less likely to support that. This is data from Sweden and Finland, and the same also on Turkish demand. So people who think that minority rights are important and sort of, therefore, this is a proxy for caring about the reputational effects of just acquiescing. I'm almost done. Yes, great, thanks. Acquiescing to Turkish demands, so they care about reputation and the contagion effects. They're much more willing to resist Turkish demands, even if that means staying out of NATO. But those who really want to have NATO accession and care about the security, they're much more willing to say, let's just compromise with Turkey, no matter what. Right? So we see these things, this applies more broadly, and it's a useful heuristic, I think, to think through these things. Anyways, so to conclude, voter-endorsed challenges to international institutions have become more frequent. They create considerable contagion risks, and they can be difficult to manage. And this is because voters and governments care about both contagion risks and about maintaining cooperation gains, and the trade-offs and the dilemmas it creates when you cannot have both are difficult, right? They do face this accommodation dilemma when the contagion risks and cooperation gains at risk are both high. So I think that the accommodation dilemma provides a parsimonious framework to understand the responses to a diverse set of challenges to international cooperation, and provide some insights into why, why it's not so easy to manage these non-cooperative situations, but also that it's not just being tough on someone, but there's actually rationale for taking a non-accommodative stance. That I close, and thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Stefanie. You did an excellent job on timing. So I would like to collect some questions if you like. Is there any question? Okay, so meanwhile that people think I can take the privilege of asking one myself. So the question is, according to you, what is now the most crucial challenge that Europe is facing in terms, I mean, for its own survival, in terms of this, looking at this accommodation dilemma? You gave some examples throughout your talk, so I was wondering what is the one that you believe is most crucial?
I was just recently at an event where somebody, what's the biggest challenge for the world? And people said 4 different things. And for each of them, I said, yeah, that's true. And it just, there's really a lot of challenges right now. But I mean, I think, of course, dealing with Russia is one where this really is important one. It's also, how to deal with the US is also not so easy with the IRA and with sort of, what do we do if Trump pulls out of NATO, these kind of things. I mean, we don't know where they're going to go, but overall, of course, the US has become less cooperative than they used to. Think about WTO, for example, do you accommodate or not? Right now, I think the Europeans are sort of trying a middle ground, sort of setting up the separate dispute resolution mechanism, but what do you do, right? So I think there's quite a lot of these, of course, within the EU, the rule of law crisis is also really a problem, I think. Yeah, Hungary and Poland, yeah. So, and also this general question of how do you deal, like if enlargement comes, then you cannot have a veto right for 35 countries or something. So I actually think it's hard for me to pick one because I think, yeah, okay. So I'll go with these 3. But I think, so what this shows, I think, is that this is not a Brexit story, but this is really a really difficult situation. It's much easier to, I mean, there's also trade-offs involved in creating cooperation. But managing non-cooperation is really tricky. Is one case.
Let's turn to the public again.
Mm-hmm. No, it's not naive at all. Of course, in surveys, people can only say what they're being asked, right? And this was a survey where my questions were very limited. I could ask like 5 or 6, so there's not that much because it was this big omnibus. So that's not a question that I asked. I know from other research that people tend to think that referendums are very good, but I think what this shows is really how, like a national referendum, which is always, of course, done within one country, that has huge transnational effects. It's problematic because also in democratic terms, because of course Brexit also had effects on all the other EU 27 countries, but of course nobody voted there. So I mean, I think sort of in political theory terms, I would say it's not so clear. In addition to that, I think, for example, with the Brexit referendum, I think a problem was there that they did not have to put down a proposal in favor of, like, they didn't vote in favor of something, but they voted against something. And of course, it was much easier to draw together, these very disparate camps, like from the very right and for the very left, who had very different visions of what Brexit would mean. Right? That's also why Theresa May afterwards said, oh, Brexit means Brexit, because nobody really knew what Brexit meant, because they didn't have a clear vision. They just knew that they were against the EU. They wouldn't, I'm pretty confident saying that I think Brexit would never have happened if they had to put out a vision and say, do you want to stay in the EU or you want to have this model? I think that would not have happened. And then I think what the UK case also shows is how problematic it is to have a referendum in a political system that's very much like has institutions that are not built to deal with referendums. So the Swiss case, for example, shows you they have very inclusive It's also sometimes things move very slowly in Switzerland, but part of it is because we have this very divisive tool of referendums, and the rest of the political institutions are built in a way to bring that back together, to heal these things. So then when you have such a divisive thing, then the solution will always be somewhere in the middle. But in the UK, with the system where also people from the culture, so somebody wins and somebody loses, then they went all, I mean, I would never have predicted that Brexit would look the way it does now in 2016.
Well, actually, when you mentioned the risks gains, the way there was disaster, or how did you evaluate the situation ex post? But how can we have it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the understanding is there. So we have a paper on the Greek referendum and how the EU acted before, during the referendum campaign. I mean, it was an exceedingly short campaign. It was just a few days, like a week and a half. But of course, you know, that referendum also had the risk of really putting a lot of the Eurozone at risk and the euro, because I mean, Italy and Spain, and especially Spain and Portugal, also had IMF programs. Were sort of looking at why do they not have to keep their austerity and we have to implement it and so on. So there was a lot of concern about contagion risks. And the EU really signaled in a very costly manner during the campaign by cutting Greece off the target increase, right? And then they had to impose capital controls, and there was capital flights. So I would argue that even before a vote, the other member states have to think about these things, and they can actually also think about these things, and they act on that, right? And then sort of in an effort to prevent such situations.
Right. So I think we can close this session, and now we leave the floor to we don't have any break. No, so we go straight to the following one.